So today in our open topic, we'll be discussing Warbeasts, the strengths and weaknesses, as well as strategies and synergies that can be used with Warbeasts. So just to give like a background summary of Warbeasts, there are currently, I think, 4 profiles in the game of Warbeasts. So there's the War Mumak of Harad, there's the War Mumak of Far Harad, which is the same profile, except it always comes with the Beastmaster upgrade, and it has a base cost of 25 more points, I believe. And then we have the Mumak War Leader, which is like an upgraded Mumak profile with the Far Harad King on it from Gondor at War. And then the last War Beast profile is the Great Beast of Gorgoroth. So just to give some background to War Beast, what they share in common is that even though they are monsters, unlike other monsters, they can't use brutal power attacks. And each War Beast has a commander sitting on a Howdah. And when you move them, they can trample over friendly and enemy models when they come in base contact with them. And Pat, do you pivot like every 4 inches?
No, you just pivot the once and then you move.
Pivot at the start of your movement and then you move straight. Yeah. And so a War Beast will stop moving either when it finishes its full movement or when it fails to slay an enemy.
You also have the option where if you come in contact with your own friendly model, you can choose to either trample it or you can choose to stop, which you can use as a little bit of a break mechanism for it. Otherwise, it has to continue moving until it's done.
Yeah. I didn't know that.
It can be a neat trick. You can stop if you want to. You don't have to trample your own troops, but it can also be quite fun to, leave a screen of your own troops and just trample over all of them so you can get at your opponents.
That actually adds a lot of tactical flexibility because I thought it had to, like, once it starts going, it doesn't stop unless it fails to kill. So,
I think the last main War Beast rule that they all share is the Stampede rule, which whenever a War Beast suffers a wound, the player with the War Beast has to make a courage test, and they can use the driver's courage. And if the War Beast fails the test, then the next turn, the opposing player can control it. So essentially running over your own models. I guess knowing, like, having played with and against some War Beasts, I would say that the biggest strength to War Beast is just that mechanic of being able to run over models and deal damage in the movement phase. Would you guys agree with that?
100%, yeah. I mean, your whole tactic kind of becomes about getting off that. In the case of a Mumak, you might only even get off one or maybe a couple. You'll be lucky if you get off a couple of tramples, but if you get off one good trample, you might wipe out half an opponent's army, so it can be super effective.
Yeah, it's definitely the reason you take these guys is for that big, scary trample, and then also, I guess, partially the psychological effect of, look at this big bad model, and anything that gets in front of it is probably going to die if I move first.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add on to that is just as the opponent, you just have to change your play style, especially if you're taking a traditional like shield wall line. You definitely don't want to be sticking in, big clumps against like a Mumak or a Great Beast of Gorgoroth. So just forcing you to change your own game plan if you're coming up against something like that.
Yeah, I also think that it can be really frustrating against less mobile armies, especially armies that don't have any movement 8 or 10 or up models, because the War Beast has quite a bit of a threat range, especially when the driver can call a heroic march. And that can just be devastating. That has a higher threat range than your typical cavalry model. So if your force is low mobility, it can do a lot of damage to you in the first turn of combat.
I mean, and in addition to that, both the Great Beast and the Mumak usually are mounted with a crap ton of archers. So we're talking like a shooting tower, basically. So if you're not shooting back, then that's an issue.
At least we don't have to deal with poisoned rocks anymore. That's so dumb.
And poison rocks are still a thing because the army bonus says it applies poison to all weapons, and the rocks are a shooting attack.
I thought.
So
Yeah.
I would argue that poison rocks have not been removed this edition.
Additionally, all Hadron Warriors and Raiders may apply the poison weapon special rule to all of their weapons.
All their weapons.
Frick out of here. I mean, FAQ, I swear they got rid of this. No.
The shooting should not be, it's fairly major, and especially from the Moomak, they're really elevated, so they're not going to have in the ways very much of the time. It can be fairly easy for them to pick on, heroes on horses or, kind of those priority targets. You're going to have line of sight to a lot without having to deal with in the ways with them, so they can be quite effective. The downside is you've got kind of half of them on one side of the Moomak and half on the other, so it's hard to bring them all to bear, but the shooting can be quite impressive.
I guess the one issue Moomaks have is kind of once you can sort of surround them and get a lot of troops into them, you can start to bring them down. But I think the other thing is just that they are so expensive that, correct me if I'm wrong, it does count as like 13 models because you would have the 12.
That would be 14 because 12 and then the driver and then the Moomak counts as one.
Right, so it's
13. Wait, what does it count as 2?
Yeah.
I think it counts as 1.
It's both the Moomak and the driver. They count as 2 by themselves.
Alex started off on the weaknesses, and I will say that, I do agree that being able to maneuver such a big base is one of their main weaknesses. You also have to think about your local meta and how much terrain is typically on a tournament table, because there are certain like wooded forest maps or like ruins of Osgiliath where the Moomak just cannot enter an area of the board, and all you'll be able to do is shoot with them.
Yeah, I'd be curious. Some of you guys have been to Nova, and I have not yet. Could you run a Moomak at Nova, or the board's too crowded? I know they're quite full of terrain there, so.
You definitely could run one, because I think Devin tries to go around and make sure there are like avenues, but they are quite terrain dense boards anyway. So it's like I wouldn't go with one and like try to go top tables with one.
It would be hard at Nova just because there would be a lot of areas where your opponent could potentially hide archers or hide things that would make it difficult for your Moomak to get at targets. It definitely is harder. It can be done, but like Ian said, it's definitely limiting. But what I was getting off on, the weaknesses, getting onto those, was just that it is such an expensive model, even if it counts as 14, kind of, if you can entrap it a little bit and you can start to really wear it down because it doesn't have any kind of heroic strike and it is only fight 4, that if you avoid it, if you can target the rest of the army, you can essentially fight your way around the Moomak a little bit. But
the thing about Warbeasts is they never count as trapped. So that's like one thing that helps is survivability. So I wouldn't say that if a Warbeast is trapped, it would go down. Like it would still require like a big hero, I think.
Like, I'm aware that you can't trap it. I don't mean like to trap it as in to get double strikes, but to be able to kind of surround it and make it very difficult for it to go places or for you to be able to get as many strikes at it as possible because it does have such a massive base. You could do a lot of damage, but at the same time, like when you talk about the psychological effect of having to play against a Moomak, when it's a move 8 war beast that just tramples in your direction, will walk over any of its own troops to get to you and then absolutely demolish entire battle lines. The number of times at like either a tournament or something, I just walk up and I'm just like, I look at my opponent and I'm like, is that your Moomak? And he's like, yep. And I'm like, oh no, elephant's scary. Biggest strength, big. Biggest weakness, also big. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Just to go along with the weaknesses of a Warbeast, I would say that shooting and magic to a certain extent. Shooting because in the case of the Moomak, and I guess of the Great Beast as well, the driver is usually up in the front exposed. Because for the Moomak, you usually, if you're not taking the War Leader, you'll probably want a Beastmaster. And then the Orc driver on the Gorgoroth Beast is also in the front. So it can be shot down and then you're out of might and courage is lower and it just goes downhill from there. And then also just how magic works with Warbeasts. They're usually targeted at the driver. And again, the driver is more vulnerable and he's kind of the piece that keeps the Warbeast at its maximum efficiency. So if the driver is targeted, then you're in danger.
No, that jives with my experience playing one in a tournament. Shooting and magic were the two biggest weaknesses for exactly the reasons you mentioned. There's a couple of things about magic that can really mess it up. Wizards like Saruman that have a long sorceress blast, they can blast the either the Beastmaster Chieftain, or if you're, say, running the War Leader, they can literally blast him off of the Mumok, at which point then he's no longer controlling the Mumok anymore, which, assuming they even survive the fall, means that you've just lost a huge critical element of your Mumok. The other one is Compel, and this could come into play in like the double Great Beast list. And it's kind of an important thing to consider if you are running a double Great Beast list. You do not want your Warbeasts to run into each other ever. And as a result, you don't really want them that close together. If your opponent can compel one into the other, it kind of starts this chain reaction of damage and stampeding that pretty much is unstoppable, and they will just both die almost immediately. So magic can be quite scary if you're playing a Warbeast.
So just looking at the upgrade options, what do you guys think are like the key ones for a Warming Mac?
Rocks, because poisonous rocks.
It's crazy. Strength 6, re-rolling like all these things. Like, it's only range 6, but it's insane.
Range 6 is actually a big deal because you measure it from the model's base, so it actually doesn't shoot very far. Typically, like, the target has to be pretty close to the Mumac's base. I think you usually get it to throw into combat.
Yeah, or you knock off spear supports. But basically, it means if the enemy tries to put a concerned effort into trying to kill the Mumac, all the spear supports, or even the guys like heroes who are in combat with it, there's like a decent chance they're going to lose their horse or take a wound or whatever, just because all these rocks suddenly just start falling off everywhere.
You could take repelling lines instead and just, again, do the Green Dragon tactic of just drop troops out of the Howdah to peel off models, which is an option.
I think Husk Weapons is pretty essential, since trampling is your winning strategy when you're taking a Mumac. Having that extra 4th dice when you make those trample rolls, it increases your chance of killing.
When 3 strength 9 hits isn't enough.
Yeah.
I think actually the Beastmaster Chieftain, from what I found, was the most crucial upgrade, because he gives you an extra courage, he gives you an extra might, he gives you an extra will, and they're pretty important. In fact, somebody did some math this was on one of the Facebook groups, maybe a year ago, about what upgrades would help you resist stampeding the most. And the one they came up with was the Beastmaster Chieftain actually makes the biggest impact. So, and then I think Sigils of Defiance is actually pretty darn important as well. Just again to give you an extra dice to resist getting compelled. But it's a little more hit or miss. If you're not up against a caster, then it's obviously just wasted points.
What about the Gnarled Hide for the extra defense?
As someone who loves to take any possible upgrade to defense that I can get anywhere, that's something that immediately catches my eye. But at the exact same time, when you look at it, Mumac's defense 7 has 10 wounds. I know obviously you want to take as few wounds as possible because you don't want to have to take those courage tests. But I feel like for the cost, you can probably find better upgrade options just because, like I said, 10 wounds and defense 7. I feel like it's a little bit redundant, maybe.
I think you're mostly worried about shooting with the defense. So if the Mumok gets swarmed, you've kind of done something wrong, and you're in trouble at that point, and you're probably gonna have a hard time getting him unswarmed. I mean, you're just dependent on a roll off until you run out of might. The defense 8, it does help a fair bit against strength 2 and strength 3 shooting. So
if you're facing a strength 3 army, then it could potentially save you a few courage tests because you're wounded less often. But yeah, that wouldn't be one of the first upgrades I get.
Also, Pat, you mentioned when you're swarmed, good luck getting unswarmed. I'm just thinking, have you tried just trampling again? I feel like logically that should work.
If you get it off, it's definitely the way to go.
Have you tried turning your Mumac off and turning it back on again? Because that's pretty much... It's one of those things where it sounds logical, but you're totally right. I feel like once you're kind of in that stuck space, getting to trample again can be a lot harder than it sounds like.
Yeah, you're just got to be able to win that roll off. And if you lose the first one, you're lower on might now, and you're still swarmed, and it can be tough to get out of there.
You guys haven't mentioned the rappelling lines, which I feel like is kind of important, given like that's probably the one that helps you in objective scenarios, and especially if you're running a more focused Warbeast army and you don't have as many like foot soldiers on the ground on the field, then I think it's pretty essential.
Yeah, it's like spider broodlings, but for your Mumak. Drop something off the howdah and run.
Wasn't there a strategy where you drop half trolls or something in the middle?
Yeah, so the Mumak of Farharad can do the half troll drop strategy.
So that's not bad then. I'm just looking at the last upgrade we haven't mentioned yet is the Foul Temperament. So you go up to 4 attack space, but you get a -1 penalty to all courage tests when rolling if you're going to stampede. So I'm assuming you never take that.
I do not see the point in that one. I mean, if you want the extra attack, you want it in the trample, not in the combat. I mean, they're not that high a fight anyway.
Yeah, and since the Mumak is capped at fight 4, with the exception of the war leader, they're all at fight 4. So I don't know. I don't think adding an extra attack is amazing.
My personal choice would be I would always take the Beastmaster Chieftain first. I would probably take Sigils of Defiance second. And if I was considering other upgrades, I would probably strongly consider just going the route of the Royal War Mumak with the Mumak War Leader.
I will say that's probably the most competitive option for the Mumak because it comes with 3 upgrades. Gnarled Hide, Sigils of Defiance, and Tusk Weapons. 3 really good upgrades that already nearly adds up to 400 points. And then you also have a leader that is 3 wounds, which is the most durable of any of the drivers in the game. And assuming you take him in the Legion, he can call Heroic Strike. I believe if you make him the leader, he's the only one that can call Strike, right?
Yeah, he has to be in base contact with the opponent's enemy leader for you to be able to do that. But yeah. You can, or you can combat off of your off the enemy leader as well if desired.
Yeah, it'd be a free Heroic Strike too.
His special rule, though, where he basically on a 4-up, I think it is, he cancels an opposing heroic move that's called within 6 inches of him, is just amazing. It just means he's so much more likely to get that heroic move off if he needs to.
And I guess if the opponent wants to challenge him and they're afraid that he's going to get that 4-up, then they might call 2 heroic moves and use up twice the amount of might because it cancels the first one.
Yeah, not the second. Yeah.
So just while we're on the subject of the war leader, I think you always run the Legion if you're going to take the war leader, just because of the buffs that it gives him.
There's really no downside other than you lose a couple of some of the options that you could put on the Mumak, but otherwise you still get everything in either your Serpent Order or Farharad lists. So there's almost no downside to going with the Legion.
So basically, just jumping back to the pricing and who you select. So would you guys basically say if you want to go for like a quote-unquote budget Mumak, you'd go for the basic one with just the chieftain on it, and then in most other cases, you just go for the war leader, big 400-point guy.
I think that's probably a good way to go. I mean, I haven't done the super budget with the repelling lines, and I think that would be pretty interesting to explore. And I do think the repelling lines could be actually pretty cool. So I'm less certain about that one, but I think there's a lot of potential there.
Too bad you can't put a demolition in there.
Bad. No.
So is this like the Warbeasts with the demolition charge that are going to drop bombs onto the opposing?
Yeah, this one would be more like a tank, though. The tank commander.
Just pop a grenade out the hatch, boys. We'll be all right.
Exactly. I'm playing Modern Warfare while people are playing, medieval ages.
Just to talk a little bit about the Great Beast of Gorgoroth, moving on to that a little bit. It being in the Mordor list, I think, is interesting and also being only 150 points, it seems like it's a lot easier to sneak it into a list, because for the Mumak, when you put on the crew and the upgrades, it's going to be well over 300 points, and the rest of your army composition is just going to have to work around it. And the Great Beast seems to be an exception to that. It seems like at 150 points, that's like about the cost of a troll. You can kind of sneak it in and still have like a healthy model count, especially when the Howdah comes with like 9 archers. So your model count isn't really hurt by it, I don't think.
The efficiency is really good, actually. It's really points efficient, because if you're going by an Orc captain, and the Orc commander is slightly better than a regular Orc captain anyway with the extra courage, but with the 9 bowmen, that's already roughly 100 points. So you're basically paying 50 points for the Great Beast, which is really, really good, considering what it can do.
Also, I'm not suggesting people would really want to spam out bows and mortar, but I'm pretty sure they don't count towards your bow limit, right?
I do not believe that they do.
That's the one thing that I remember about the one that Charles played at Nova is like, there's the 3 Warbeasts or whatever it was, and that looks scary enough. But then there's, what is it, like 20-something bows all of a sudden?
So that just going into that list a little bit, at 800 points, it was 3 Great Beasts, and then it was like 10 Orc Warriors with shields. Like the main strategy with it was just to shoot, and with the 3 Warbeasts, also supported by 2 Mounted Ring Wraiths. I think it was the Tainted, and then either Shadow Lord or Witch King, one of the two. And you don't see the Tainted a lot, and I think it was added in intentionally here. He has a special rule that can prevent both sides from benefiting from heroic moves. And what he tried to do was he would call that ability with the Tainted, and then I wouldn't be able to heroic move to pin his Great Beasts. And so whenever he won priority, he would be able to move them first into my army. And I think that was a really good trick, and it synergized well with the Great Beast.
I like that idea. My only issue with that is that it's only 2 strength 6 hits. So a lot of the time, it's just going to stall out pretty quickly after a couple guys, right? It's not super unlikely you'll roll under a 4+ with 2 dice, right?
Yeah, I kind of had the advantage that game because I was running a primarily defense 7 list. I was doing a Fountain Court Guard list, so it would just be like speed bump after speed bump, and it wasn't ideal for him. I could see it working at maybe against a defense 6 or lower list. It might be a little more consistent.
I mean, I think that was also a very all-in list. Like, it was just his Great Beast doing everything. But like we said in the beginning, at 150 points, if you slot him in an 800-point list with like a regular force, you still have 650 points of just whatever you would normally bring in Mordor. So you could probably still get to a near 50 model count. So it would just be like an additional threat that the opponent has to worry about, and you're not relying on it to win. So even if you come up against a defense 7 army, it's not that big of a pitfall.
One thing I do like about this, and maybe I'm overstating the strength of this point here, but you essentially pay 150 points, you get the War Beast, and then you get what is nearly a whole warband of orcs that don't count towards your bow limit. I know their bow fire isn't very good, but you essentially get 9 bows that don't count towards the bow limit, and the entire warband is contained on the Howdah, and it's partially protected from bow fire because of that in the way, which I think can be really helpful given the fact that they've got the low defense. It's kind of like a self-contained warband that just kind of moves around in a way that is really threatening if you pair it with a standard 800-point list.
Yeah, I think them shooting from the platform really helps them in this case because you don't really feel the short 18-inch range because the Great Beast is going to be up close anyway. And 9 of them shooting into a mounted hero is actually pretty scary for your opponent. You only need 1 arrow to wound that horse, and just being in an elevated position, you have less in the ways, and it just seems like an ideal spot to shoot from.
You only need 1 arrow to wound that horse is also my motto when I'm playing my Mordor list. I always have 6 bows in there, and that's exactly what that does.
I definitely agree. It's one instance where orc bows aren't actually that bad because, yeah, you're only hitting on 5s, but you're always hitting on 5s. Like, because it doesn't matter if you move or not. You're always going to be moving, but you're always getting the 5. It actually turns out to be decent when you have that volume of shots, even if it's at like a bad shoot value.
Yeah, I think they're pretty efficient. I'm a little surprised we don't see more of them, honestly. I just think they Yeah, they give that mobile platformer shooting. They give an opportunity to, maybe it's not going to be super reliable, but to get kills without having to win fights. I think they're pretty good.
I mean, this is like really lowering the bar in terms of what's good shooting, but for Mordor, this is exceptional. You get a 5-up shoot that can move 8 inches and still get a 5-up shoot with 9 bows, considering what I've seen 6 honesty bows do in games before.
I feel like maybe the reason it's not out is like just partially because of the model, because from what I've heard, the original Finecast run of these things was just horrible to assemble.
Yeah, I have 2 of them sitting on my shelf that are in progress but not assembled. They came out later with one that is one piece, so I think you have to attach the legs, but it's not 2 pieces that you have to join together, so it's a little easier to deal with.
I think it became Forge World resin because I think it was a different color in the box.
It definitely feels like Forge World resin, not the Finecast. So,
any closing thoughts on the Great Beast or the Mumak profile?
My only comment is I think all of them synergize sort of interestingly with. I think they work fairly well with cavalry heavy forces. Maybe more so the Mumak than the Great Beast because they force your opponent to split up. Then you've got fast-moving cavalry that can sort of pick off units one at a time that don't have to deal with a formed-up battle line. So, in fact, the reason I have the 2 Great Beasts of Gorgoroth is I was hoping to put together a double Great Beast, lots of Warg Rider lists, and we'll see how that goes. After I'm done with a Haradrim experiment, that might be traveling north.
It's not an experiment, Pat. You've been playing Haradrim for 2 years. This is a full-blown army at this point.
All right. Well, maybe I have a problem then.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think the moving around with cavalry is good, but also just anything that also can do damage in the move phase. So if he gets pinned, then you can try and wipe out the thing that's pinning it and then get the Mumak to go. So, like, camels would perfect example, or even just something with throwing weapons is still handy.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think the Far Harad Mumak might be scarier than the Serpent Horde Mumak.
All right, so that has been our discussion on Warbeasts. Thank you all for listening, and thanks to Pat for coming on as a guest today. Look forward to the next episode of Into the West podcast.